Hello, we want to look at democratic governance. This is our continuation of the discussion on the methods of governance or types of governance. Previously, we looked at dictatorial governance and also understood the various facets of dictatorial governance. So today, we want to look at democratic governance with emphasis on three main areas. Number one, we want to understand exactly what is meant by democratic governance. We also want to understand the various variants or types of democratic governance. We'll also look at conditions that are necessary for a truly democratic governance to thrive. And then we shall conclude our discussion by attempting to understand some of the weaknesses or limitations of democratic governance. Welcome. We want to understand democracy as a form of government in which governing power is derived from the people either by direct referendum or by means of elected representatives of the people. In Kenya, for instance, we elect members of parliament, members of county assembly, we also elect the president. In that sense, therefore, in Kenya, we practice what we call representative democracy. Therefore, we still govern ourselves, but through elected representatives. And as I've mentioned, these are senators, women reps, members of parliament, members of of the Senate, and the president, as well as his or her deputy. Although now democracy has its origin in ancient Greece, other cultures have significantly contributed to the evolution of democracy. For instance, ancient Rome, Europe, North, as well as South America. They have indeed practiced democracy, and some of their democratic principles have been adopted by other countries, especially most countries in Africa. For instance, in Kenya, we have a mix of both British and American democratic credentials. Although whether we live up to the expectations of democratic principles of those countries, that is another question. Democracy has also been described as the last form of government and has spread considerably across the globe. Indeed, some politicians or political scholars or political philosophers have uh, described democracy as the worst form of government, but still the best. That is, compared to dictatorial government, despite its weaknesses, it remains one of the leading lights of forms of governments that has uh, catapulted modern societies into progress. As I mentioned earlier, democracy can exist in various forms. So I want us to look at the various forms of democracy. One of them is called representative democracy. This form of democracy involves the selection of government officials by the people being represented. And the mechanism that is mostly used to achieve this is normally election of candidates with a majority or a plurality of the votes. That is, we pick candidates, and we individuals who have offered themselves to represent us at various levels of political representation are then voted in. The one that receives the majority of the votes is considered the winner and the duly elected to represent citizens. Again, representatives may be elected or become diplomatic representatives by a particular constituency or represent the entire electorate. That is, in other settings, we call that one proportional representation. And one of the characteristics of representative democracy is that while the representatives are elected by the people to act in their interest, they retain the freedom to exercise their own judgment on how best to undertake this. In other words, we elect members of parliament, we elect members of county assembly, we also elect members of the Senate to represent us. But each time an issue arises that requires decision, they are required to exercise good judgment. and ensure that the decisions they make or the considerations they make bears or represent the best interests of the people they represent in those legislative institutions. So when you talk of representative democracy, we are saying that that is what they are required to do. But it's also important for us to understand that there are certain issues that before a decision is made, the original mandate of the electorate is sought. For instance, if you want to make fundamental changes in the constitution, then you have to undertake a referendum. A referendum means you go to seek the primary mandate of the electorate. Such decisions an elected representative cannot make on behalf of the electorate, and that's why countries have provisions in their constitutions and laws that designates that certain decisions require full and original approval of citizens through the referendum. In Kenya, for instance, changing the terms of the president, say from 5 year, which is stipulated the current constitution, maybe to another year, reducing it or increasing it, or removing the time limits of the president, requires a referendum. That is, you must come back to the people and seek their views. If they approve, you make the changes. If they don't approve, the status quo remains. Another modern form of democracy is called parliamentary democracy. And this is a representative democracy where government is appointed by parliamentary representatives. Government in this form of democracy is exercised by delegation to an executive ministry. The government is formed by the party or coalition of parties with parliamentary majority, and parliament provides checks and balances on the executive on behalf of citizens. This is what happens in countries such as the UK, Australia, India, among others. What happened in this case is that it is a work of citizens to elect members of parliament. Once members of parliament are elected, then the party that receives the majority of elected members of parliament, or a coalition of political parties that garners majority of members of parliament, then forms the government. From that coalition or from the party that succeeded in achieving the greatest number of members of parliament, then they produce the leader of government, which in most cases is called the prime minister. The prime minister, therefore, sits both in the executive as head of government and also represents the executive in parliament as a member of parliament. And that arrangement only persists as long as that coalition or the political party that forms government has majority members of parliament. Anytime that that number comes down and a new coalition or a different political party has now more members of parliament than the previous one, then that particular political party and the prime minister must vacate the executive, and then the new one now comes in to form the executive. This is sometimes uh, considered hybrid in the sense that there is no clear separation between the executive and the legislature, because the prime minister heads the executive arm of the government and at the same time is a member of parliament. Members of the executive, such as ministers, are also elected members of parliament. Others argue that by sitting in parliament, they can better articulate or understand the issues that representatives raise on behalf of the electorate. But other people think that being on both sides distracts them from fully undertaking their duty, and it also compromises the ability of the legislature to fully provide checks and balances on the executive. So others say we need a very clear separation where the executive is completely divorced from parliament, and parliament is also completely divorced from the executive, and each now should act both independently and interdependently. The other form of democracy is called constitutional democracy, And these are forms of government where elected representatives exercise power, but their authority is limited by a constitution. The constitution protects individual rights, ensures the rule of law, and balances majority rule with minority protections. The constitution is the highest law controlling and regulating government institutions in this form of democracy. Mechanisms such as free elections, an independent judiciary, and other institutions are established to ensure government accountability. When you talk about constitutional democracy, we simply mean a political arrangement in which the constitution is considered a supreme document, and everything that is done must be done according to the provisions of the constitution. Anytime human behavior, especially of elected officials or appointed officials, those officials of government or governing institutions, behave in a manner that contradicts the constitution, what then follows is a petition in court to declare their activities unconstitutional, and perhaps even go further to prescribe punishment that should befall such individuals. In this case, therefore, there is strict observance of the Constitution, and every action is guided by various provisions of the Constitution. In many cases, again, where the executive is unsure whether the direction it wants to take is clearly stated or not in the Constitution, and therefore the fear that they might violate the Constitution, they are at liberty to seek the judicial interpretation of clauses that they find ambiguous, and therefore that clarity guides them in terms of the kind of decisions they make. So when you talk about constitutional democracy, we simply mean a governing system in which every conduct, every activity is strictly guided by the Constitution, and violation of the Constitution invites a reprimand by the public and a petition to the judicial authorities to declare such actions unlawful, null and void, as well as to prescribe punishments that should be meted on individuals that violate the Constitution. In Kenya, we have seen quite a number of times when decisions of the executive are challenged in courts. And in quite a considerable number of cases, courts have indeed agreed with the Kenyans that the executive acted outside the provisions of the Constitution. And in such cases, such decisions have been declared null and void. So when you look at this, Kenya has a semblance of constitutional democracy, but also a semblance of representative democracy. What we completely lack as it is today is parliamentary system of democracy. I want us now to look at some of the essential conditions that should be in place to facilitate a truly democratic governance. One of these essential conditions is called industrialization. And industrialization, though itself does not lead to democracy, but it's assumed that the kind of economic stability, the kind of a reduction in the gap between the rich and the poor, the fact that industrialization eliminates extreme poverty, extreme suffering, and also the fact that industrial societies look better in terms of education, in terms of access to basic human services, that kind of condition is sufficient to create enough consciousness on citizens, and a more politically literate citizens stand a greater chance of making proper decisions, also stand a greater chance of questioning decisions of the governing institutions if they find them as not being appropriate and if they find them as not serving their interests. So when we talk about industrialization, we know that industrialized countries have better job opportunities, have better schooling systems, have better health services, have better infrastructure, and all these things, they improve the welfare of citizens. When you eliminate extreme suffering, then you have a citizenship that is well enlightened, a citizenship that is well informed, and it is through such information that now cultivates democratic principles. And through that, a country is therefore able to move forward. So it's on that basis that we therefore say that for a country to truly experience democracy, we need serious employment opportunities, good education system, healthcare, infrastructure, because all these they contribute to what we call a greater political socialization, greater civic consciousness, among others, and all these are essential for democratic governance. The other factor that is essential for democracy is decentralization. This is a clear limit in terms of the scope and separation of government role from other institutions. We must have a very clear separation between the work of a government bureaucracy completely separated from that one of elected political leaders. Because then we need proper independence between different duty bearers in a political system. If we don't have that, then there's a possibility of elected leaders encroaching into the functions and responsibilities of civil servants, directors, and others that also play an important role in the delivery of particular values that are associated with democracy. So we need a very clear separation of powers. We need an independent civil service that does not lean to a given political party, neither does it succumb to the whims and threats of politicians or political parties or political individuals that currently form power. We need that clear-cut independence. But decentralization also means that other groups within the society are also brought to the purview of governance. We are talking non-governmental organizations such as labor unions, businesses, and religious organizations. They all need to be brought to the purview of the governance, because if you don't do so, then it means that elected leaders or politicians will run roughshod and ensure that whatever they choose to do is done unchallenged. And that is how the seed of dictatorship is normally planted. So we need power and authority and decision making decentralized so that no one single entity within a governing system or within society monopolizes power and monopolizes decision making. Because monopoly of any sort, that is what leads to dictatorship. So that has to be discouraged as much as possible. Decentralization of power is also important because it will help in reducing instances of abuse of power, especially by political authorities. Because whatever they do, they have to ensure that they are not acting on their own alone. There are other players, and the decisions they make must be consultative, must be participatory. And any sign where exclusion exists, then such authorities would inevitably challenge the decisions that are made by political leaders. So it is important that decision making, be it in terms of legislation, be it in terms of resource distribution, be it in terms of resource mobilization, it is decentralized. It is not concentrated in one single arm or in one single institution. Because if that is done, then we shall be gravitating towards dictatorship. Another important essential condition for the realization of democracy is what we call shared values. What do we mean by values? Values are the foundation principles, beliefs, and standards that guide behavior, decisions, and priorities in life. In other words, we must have values. Values tell us what is right, tell us when to act in a particular way, tell us how to behave in a particular circumstance, and also guides us in terms of the kind of decisions that we make. And that becomes important. So we are saying that there must be values that a given society considers essential, and such values must be observed at all times. If such values exist, then decisions that are made will revolve around uh, the preservance or the preservation of such values. For instance, what is our value on corruption? What is our value on free and fair elections? What is our value on the rule of law? All these become important because at one point they become the building blocks of a democratic institution. If we do not have values on how we do things, we don't have values on how we create standards, we don't have values on how we resolve our conflicts, we don't have values on how we manage our differences, we don't have values on how we make decisions, then we are likely to have a country that is chaotic. And in the absence of such values, one figure, one political figure will come in and impose his values. And his values might actually not be palatable or enjoyable by others. And that is how they install themselves as the ultimate leaders, and therefore dictatorship is planted and allowed to thrive in a country where we do not have shared values. So, for us to grow as a country that realizes full democracy, then we must have standards. These standards must be observed by everyone without compromise. Then there are certain weaknesses that have been found to exist in democracy. In other words, democracy is not a perfect system of government, although it is regarded as the best ever devised by man, given the alternative of dictatorship being a worse one. So democracy also has certain limitations, which I want us to look at. One of them is political instability. And democracy is criticized for not offering enough political stability as governments are frequently elected on and off. This also results in frequent policy changes with regard to business, which deter investment and so hinder economic growth. Furthermore, protests, media criticisms may also force sudden change in political leadership as well as governments. Democracy is therefore considered undesirable for a developing country in which the economic growth and the reduction of poverty are top priorities. Let me probably look at this in the context of Kenya. For instance, in Kenya, we hold elections each after every 5 years. We hold election, we change leaders. All elected leaders are subjected to elections. When they win, they go back. When they do not win, they leave. Some of the leaders lose despite having considerable uh, vision, uh, better plans, but because of constitutional provisions that demand that elections have to be done after every 5 years, they are subjected to that particular time. Again, even the best president, for instance, Kenya has had Kibaki, whom to date is regarded as the best president. Kibaki had to leave vacant office after 5 years because that is what the constitution meant. But there was a general feeling that, for instance, if he were to be left for a fairly longer period of time, probably Kenya as a country could have gained much more. And in the process, we could have probably, if policies continued and he was there to oversee their implementation, probably areas such as economy, education, healthcare, among others, could have gained much and achieved a lot. So political instability is thought to be there. For instance, in Kenya, we have been campaigning since the last election, 2022. The president and his team and the opposition, all politicians, have been campaigning both at national level and grassroots level. And some of these campaigns breed chaos, some of which might not support or are not conducive for businesses and investments. And therefore, this is why democracy is considered undesirable, especially for a developing country, because it discourages investments if we do not have proper structures that ensures peaceful campaigns and also that restricts how political activities are conducted. Others also find democracy as an oppression by the majority. Indeed, Democrats argue that democracy is about minority having their say, but majority having their way. And as long as you are many, then the decision you arrived at has to be accommodated by the minority, even if it injures them. And has been criticized by critics of democracy. They argue that this type of uh, 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 this type of bullying of minority, or what we call kleptocracy, is not a very good thing, because even minorities are also citizens, and sometimes the gap between the winner and the loser in a democratic contest sometimes it is quite small. And again, it might also not be clear that a significant number of people who might have been opposed to the candidate that won probably did not participate in the election process. For instance, in Kenya, in the last election, we had about 22 million registered voters out of a possible population of 45 million, meaning therefore less than half of the population registered as voters. Out of that half, the total number of people who voted for the president was about 16,000, rather 16 million, shared between the leading candidates. Now, when you look at again that, then it means therefore that the president was chosen by about 8 million of the 45 plus million population that constitutes Kenya. When you look at that as a percentage of the total population, it's quite small. So actually, the majority of Kenyans did not participate in the election of the president that we have today. And it's not just today, the same case with what happened in previous elections. But because the few that turned up and voted, and because they constituted the majority of those who stood up and voted, then the person they chose carries the day. And the others that did not participate, even if they are the silent majority, the fact that they did not come out to vote, then they have to accept the ideas. However oppressive, however unpalatable they have to live by that. This is why we are saying that democracy is a kind of oppression by the majority. Unlike dictatorship, which is an oppression by the minority, democracy is an oppression by the majority. In all cases, it is still oppression, although it is a better form of oppression. But this system of government is also accused of short-termism. Short-termism means that decisions are based on election cycles. In Kenya, for instance, we hold election after every 5 years. So sometimes presidents, governments, they make their decisions based on 5 years. And this is why they consider that as being too short in the life of a country that aspires to be great and provide the best for its citizens. So each time political leaders make decisions based on the election cycle, and this sometimes makes them fail to appreciate the bigger picture and the long-term needs of a country. Budget cycles are made based on 5 years. Politicians make decisions based on what they want to achieve. Some of them are simply designed to address short-term interests rather than the broader goals and benefits that our citizens can accrue from that. For instance, as we approach the next year's elections, if you look at the budget that will come, there's a possibility that certain budgetary allocations will generally target individuals or winning support for the incumbent rather than addressing the long-term needs of society. The last issue that we want to look at, which is also considered a weakness of democracy, is the irrational voters. Do voters really think rationally when they go to vote? This is the question that this thing comes in. For instance, in Kenya, we are complaining that the current president is not delivering. But there's a region that supported it almost to a man on the belief that he is the best among the other contestants. So the question is, barely 3 years down the line, the same region that supported him overwhelmingly now clearly hates him. Yet another region that completely opposed him now appear to embrace him. Where then is the irration? Where then is the rationality of voters here? These are the questions that political scientists tend to raise with regard to democracy. How rational, how reasonable, how informed, how enlightened, how right thinking are politicians, are voters when they come to the choice of political leaders. Because we choose them, then within a very short time, we blame them for not delivering. Again, another election come, we pick another bad lot, replacing them with another bad lot. Yet, a few years later again, we start complaining. So the cycle continues. To what extent are voters able to make decisions that are good, that are independent, and that are futuristic? That's a question that is being laid as an argument against democracy. Thank you for listening to me.